Good evening. Welcome, welcome. Hope everybody's doing okay with the heat that we're having. Hopefully we're on the tail end of that. So today I wanted to talk a little bit about this whole notion or this idea of seeing. This usual uncomplicated thing that humans do. But first, I wanted to talk about how we, like just in English, how we sometimes use this verb to see. There's the obvious one, this like literal perception with the eyes, like I can see the mountains from here. Or maybe there's this way we use the word seeing to talk about, dating or being in a relationship. Yeah, they've been seeing one another for a few months, or, something like that. Or maybe we use this word seeing to talk about imagination, or can't you just see yourself going down the slopes in the skiing when it's so hot, or something like this, just this invitation to imagine something in particular. Or maybe we even use this expression, see, to talk about like, I'll accompany you, I'll see you to the door. Or maybe there's this way we also say that seeing is related to understanding. Oh, I see. This kind of way. I kind of like it when there's these simple words that get used in so many different ways, and we can look at them differently and understand things differently. In some ways, we might say that that's so much about a meditation practice, Buddhist practice, is about taking something that seems ordinary and looking at it in a little bit different way, and you have a different understanding, it has a different impact. So I'm going to look at this word seeing and maybe what it points to and some of the way, the experience of it from a number of different ways. And in particularly, like how this is part of a path of practice to greater freedom and ease and peace and well-being. Not only just some little intellectual curiosity, fun thing to do, but it's something that will help to bring some more ease in our lives, to understand maybe a little bit the way that we see, and maybe some of the ways we don't see as a support for practice. So first I'll start with maybe the obvious thing, using the senses, the eyes. We see. And in the classical Buddhist teachings, they talk a certain amount about this. There has to be a contact with eyeballs, I'll say, or the eye apparatus. And there has to be something out there to see in order for seeing to happen. When we say it this way, it sounds pretty obvious, but there's a way in which we could unpack that and look at that from a number of different angles, but I'm not going to here. I'm just going to highlight that there are a number of elements to this thing that we just do all day long, and that we do all day long. And one is to have a visual apparatus that works. Not everybody does. And sometimes it doesn't work so well, and maybe as we're aging, we're noticing, it doesn't work the way that it did. Or when I have my glasses on, it certainly works much better than when it doesn't, or something like that. And then also the second element, that there needs to be something to be seen. I mean, maybe that's like so obvious we don't think about it, but there's a way in which we could unpack that there requires something that belongs to the human body, and then something that doesn't belong to the human body in order for this whole seeing thing to happen. I think I'll leave it there. Right? That's pretty obvious, not so complicated. But I wanted to spend a little more time talking about this idea that the seeing, like the role that the mind has in seeing. It's not just eyeballs and nerves, the optic nerve and all that kind of stuff. Because probably we know this, but maybe I'll say it explicitly. Our eyes, or maybe I should say our experience of seeing, are not like cameras. We all have this experience where you see a picture of yourself and you're like, oh, I look like that? Because when we see ourselves in the mirror, we see ourselves in some particular way. And then when you see a photo, you're like, oh, okay, it looks a little bit different. So it's not like we get a perfectly accurate view of what's out there. And I recently heard this story, which also highlighted that sometimes we just don't notice stuff that maybe that would show up on a camera, maybe even like a Zoom camera. Maybe we have this experience of noticing sometimes during the pandemic, I spent a lot of time on Zoom, and I did a lot of teaching on Zoom. And sometimes having a curious, I wonder if this person recognizes that in their background is this, curious thing that's maybe they wouldn't want all of us to look at. And I heard this story recently of a Zen teacher who was in her Zen robes, very official, shaved head, very serious, giving a talk, and not realizing that her panties were set out to dry on a line behind her. So I'm sure, right, this probably wasn't what she was imagining when she was giving this talk. I'm sure people were kind of looking or something. I don't know. So there's this way in which sometimes we don't notice things. And in fact, this is like a well-established phenomenon that advertisers and marketers are working with and trying to influence with. And that is, maybe you've had this experience too, that I'll share. I had an experience not too long ago where I was at the shore, down there, the water, and saw, oh, look at this type of seashell. Wow, look at this. I've never seen anything like this. This is amazing. Wow, this is so great. And then when I looked again, I thought, oh, they're everywhere. I just hadn't noticed. Just that when you really look at something and now the mind kind of recognizes it, then you start to see it everywhere. People talk about this like, well, I think I'm going to buy this particular car. And then when you're driving, you start to see, oh, wow, okay, this car is everywhere, but you hadn't really noticed it before. This is actually called the Baader-Meinhof phenomena. So I didn't know it actually has a name, but there's something interesting that happens here. There's this way that there's this cognitive processes that kick in and that are affecting what we see. So there's this one in which we have this selective attention. For me, when I didn't notice, I'd been walking along the water for quite some time before I noticed, oh, wow, look at this. And then I started to see there's so much everywhere that when there's maybe subconsciously maybe decide that something is important, noteworthy, worthwhile to see. Before we hadn't made that decision, consciously or unconsciously. But once we see something, and often then it's unconscious, we start to see it more and more and more. So there's this cognitive process that has decided, oh, this is important. I'm going to notice it more. So then what wasn't seen before all of a sudden starts to become seen. And then there's this second thing that's happening is this confirmation bias. That we start to believe that something is important, so then it must also be prevalent, or if it's prevalent, it must be important. This kind of link between prevalence and importance gets made. And then because we're seeing it more often, we start to think oh, this is everywhere. Everybody thinks this, or this must be true, just because we tend to be seeing it more often. But it's just this confirmation bias, this idea that we want, because we've decided something is important, we want to see it more often. So I'm pointing this out just to highlight how the mind has a role in what is like actually what's seen. It's not so innocent, just this seeing things. Not as innocent as we might like to think. So we don't see the visual field with as much fidelity as a camera does, for example. So there's this way, so we might say that just the sense organ meeting the sense object, this is kind of like that what the Buddhist language use, would be sensing. And maybe we might say seeing is something that the mind does. When the seeing is when the mind is interpreting or analyzing or manipulating or somehow, working with this data that's coming in through the visual field. But we might also notice that there's seeing versus looking. It's kind of like this subtle difference. And so seeing is like this natural, effortless sensory experience when the sense organ meets the sense object. So there's no intentional effort, whether it's conscious or unconscious. It's just just the experience of seeing is happening. But looking is a very subtle, but it's more of an intentional, like, oh, what is going on there, and wanting to look. So there's more of a focusing in. Sometimes going for a walk, we're seeing that there's green plants all around, but then like, oh wow, look at this. Look at how there's this plant that's growing out of the sidewalk right here next to this other thing. And we stop and kind of look at it like, wow, how did that happen? I wish I could give you a great example off the top of my head, but I don't have one. But I think we all have this experience of, was that a mouse that was just going by? What was that? Looking or something. Not here, not a mouse here. I was thinking about, that did happen to me not long ago. I was out for a walk. It's like, whew, a little mouse went by. Like, oh, okay. So looking is this more intentional, directed action, whereas seeing is not so much intentional. But there's something that can happen if we become sensitive to this shift between seeing and looking. There's this way that we can learn something about ourselves. What are the types of objects that encourage this shift to really look at? For me, it was those plants, the one that was growing up out of the sidewalk, and trying to see, did it come out of this crack, or is it related to this other plant over here that, just trying to understand how it grew. Like, for me, it was, I kind of like this idea that there's greenery that can find its way in difficult circumstances, something beautiful and life. I like this notion. So there's this idea that I notice these things. It confirms this preference that I have. It's also, of course, seeing moving things. But when we become aware of this shift between seeing and looking, we start to understand ourselves better. What is it that causes this looking? What do we pause and pay attention to? And what don't we? What don't we pause and pay attention to? So what are maybe the thought patterns that we have that direct our visual attention? Here's a short little poem that talks about this by Rosemary Traumer. And this was written in February, I think February of this year, 2024, but I'm not exactly sure. And this poem goes like this. I'm not sure I could say they are beautiful, these brittle brown cinquefoil stems trembling in the wind. Though part of me longs to find beauty everywhere. Ah, the longing to see beauty shapes the way I meet the world. There, seeing this truth, beautiful as a golden flower. So just this recognition, oh yeah, she's always wanting to see beauty and is oriented towards seeing beauty, and that understanding about herself she finds beautiful. And why might it be helpful or beautiful to recognize one's preferences for seeing or what one's orientation is? Because if we have an orientation towards beauty, for example, we'll see beauty, but we will also see a lot of ugliness. Because it becomes like this frame. Is this beautiful? No. Is this beautiful? Yes. And there becomes a little bit of no, this little bit of pulling back and this, yes, oh, want more of. And then our life maybe becomes a little bit smaller because there's a lot of like, oh, that's not beautiful, get out of here. And this kind of dismissive, not wanting it to be there. Have this aversion, this subtle way, and like, we want to bat it away and go find something beautiful. For this talk, I'm talking about visual experiences, but this could be with everything. But just to have this insight, what is it that causes us to look? Maybe it's like something curious, and maybe we like to see problems, and we like to solve them. Or maybe it's something that doesn't make sense, and we have this bias that we want things to make sense. In order for us to feel safe in the world, we want to understand it, and it should be, clear to us. So then we spend a lot of our maybe life energy in trying to understand things and make sense of things that maybe it's not worth all our life energy. Maybe it's something that it's not understandable. Like, why did something or other happen? Presumably there's a reason, but do we have to spend so much energy trying to figure this out? Or maybe we tend to really look at things, or maybe I'll back up on this, or I'll continue on this. Here I am in the middle. I'm noticing how, I'm seeing how I got stuck there for a little bit, having two thoughts in my mind at the same time. This idea that maybe we are just noticing as problems because A, we like to fix things, or we're noticing things that aren't clear because B, we feel like we want to understand things. There's nothing wrong in this, but then we might understand, like, okay, how are these patterns affecting our life? Seeing problems, maybe we want to fix things because we want to be seen as one, like, okay, I can take care of it, I'm perfectly capable. And then we kind of get stuck in this identity. Then we always have to fix things because we're defining ourselves as the one who can fix things or should fix things. Or maybe we have this idea that I want to understand things because really we're not feeling safe in some kind of way, and we're feeling like, okay, if I understand it better, then I'd feel a little bit more safe. I'd feel a little bit more comfortable. So there's this way in which just seeing this recognition, from recognizing the seeing to looking shift, can really be a doorway to greater understanding. This is something that we do all the time. And when we notice it, we can also do this shift the opposite way. We can go from looking to seeing, just like relax the focusing. And maybe there's a little bit of softening. And just allow the seeing to happen. Because what happens when we just allow the seeing, then there's less judging and comparing and evaluating. And when there's less comparing, judging, and evaluating, there's more freedom. There's more freedom, there's more ease. I'm not saying that we have to stop using our intellect and not discern between what's harmful and not harmful, or what is appropriate and inappropriate, or what's helpful and not helpful. I'm not saying that. Of course, we still need to be doing that. I'm just talking about noticing just this judging and oh, that's not good enough, or how can they do that, or who do they think they are, or this comparing. Wow, that person is taller than that I am, or something like this, said from somebody who's not very tall. For me, it's remarkable how we can just notice this, the path of practice, this movement towards greater freedom. Often we can have this sense that, okay, you have to meditate, and you have to sit in a meditation posture, and it has to be a particular way, and then you'll gain some insights. But what this is pointing to is just your everyday experience. We're seeing, if we have vision, whenever the eyes are open. Well, we can see when the eyes are closed too, right? We can see the back of the eyelids. Well, I don't know what we see, but there's something there. When I'm closing my eyes, I see something. So there's this way of that we can have this understanding about actually how our minds create suffering with all this comparing and judging and evaluating, which I'm saying is distinct from discerning what is helpful and not helpful, what's wholesome and not wholesome, what's helpful, what's skillful and what's unskillful. We can start to see the role that our mind does, because not only is it doing all this judging and comparing, it's also making stories, based on what we see. There might be a way in which this visual cue has kind of triggers a reaction, and then the reaction could just lead us down this whole thought train into more and more suffering. There's this way in which this can be really helpful, that the visual field can start a thought train, a reaction. For example, if I have to remember to bring something with me when I'm going to go somewhere, maybe you guys do this too, I put something near the door. Okay, I have to remember, I will see this as I'm going to the door, and I'll remember to take it. This is really helpful. But there's also a way in which we can see things, and I'll just make this up. Oh yeah, there's that paperwork on my desk. I have to take care of it, but I can't take care of that because, that's that terrible thing that's happened. It reminds me of that, and I don't want to be reminded of that, so I'm not going to take care of this paperwork. And then it just keeps on getting later and more overdue, or whatever it might be. And then we start to feel bad, oh, I haven't taken care of that. But I don't want to, because then people will know that I didn't X, Y, or Z. And then there's this low-grade suffering that kind of shows up in our life. So these stories that are getting connected to just paper on the desk or something like this. I find myself at a loss tonight to come up with any interesting anecdotes. I'm sure all of you have more interesting examples than the ones that I'm giving, where seeing something can just starts a whole thought train that leads to a sense of unease, a sense of disquiet, a sense of just grrr, something like that. So not only do the stories that often come up after we see something, or they kind of lead to suffering because they maybe are filled with some of this judging and comparing, but it also, these stories take us away from the present moment. Like we're no longer like experiencing our life. Instead, we're off thinking about whatever it is we're thinking. Well, we're just walking past the desk. And walking past the desk feels like just a mundane thing. Why would we pay attention to that? But our life is filled with just these mundane activities. If we are dismissive just for these ordinary experiences, then there's this way in which our life just passes us by as we more and more are waiting for something titillating or to, catch our attention. Meanwhile, we're just lost in stories, which, what are stories? They're a dime a dozen. They have no, substance. They have, often they're completely fabricated. They start with an experience and whew, off they go. And that's not really living life. That's being lost in stories. And so often we don't even recognize how being lost in stories is harming us. Often we like to do it because it distracts us or diverts us from some uncomfortable experience. But then we start to become disconnected from our lives. And there's this way we kind of start to feel a little bit alienated from our life and disconnected from it. And then it can grow into being disconnected from others because we're disconnected from ourselves. And there's this way in which the stories just really turn out not to be helpful. So this shift from looking to seeing is also a way, like seeing is something that's happening right now in this present moment. I'm seeing something that's black there I don't even quite sure what it is, there on the floor. Now I know what it is, but right, just seeing instead of like a big story about it, keeping things simple. So that's another way of seeing. It's like recognizing how the mind is really influencing seeing as opposed to sensing. I'm trying to be cute that use these letter S, sense and see, but sensing is maybe we could say seeing with the senses and seeing with the mind. And then I'd like to talk about one other type of seeing, and this is what we might call insight. And that is, we might say, like seeing through something. So not seeing the surface of what something is, not even looking at the surface of something is, but seeing the qualities that it has, in particular, qualities that things arise and pass away in the visual field. Just it's their nature to arise and pass away. Things are inconstant, they're impermanent, they're not always there. There's this way in which they change, and our noticing that they're changing helps shifts our relationship to them. Our noticing that they're changing also makes them impersonal in the sense of, oh, this is something that's just shifting and changing on its own. It doesn't have to mean anything about me as a person. It has its own causes and conditions that made it arise and different causes and conditions that made it pass away. And in the same way, I'm like this, what I take myself to be is also just a collection of these experiences. I've been talking about seeing, but hearing, tasting, smelling, tactile feeling, and we could say also thinking as an experience. We could say that this insight into not only the things out there are changing, but there's nothing in here that isn't changing. Everything in here is changing also. It's just a collection of experiences. And so this way of seeing, what we might call insight, is a way that really reduces the suffering and really helps us to find more and more freedom. helps us to let go of any clinging that we might have, or let go of our expectations of how things might be, but instead just to recognize the way things are, and the way that we can, if we can like disengage from our habitual reactivity, when we start to see, oh, they're changing all the time. I don't have to make them stay. It just doesn't make sense to try to hold on to them or make them go away. They're shifting and changing already. And besides, the shifting and changing experiences are all that actually happens. There isn't an essence inside here to which experiences happen. Right? There's nothing here like that has a visual experience and then has a hearing experience and then has a tasting experience. There's just hearing, tasting, seeing, feeling, thinking. Just this collection of experiences that are coming and going. And so these two insights can lead to greater and greater freedom, the greatest freedom, I would say. We have this shift in our understanding, or this shift in the way that we see things. Like, oh, I see. It's not as constant and solid and as I was imagining or thought it was, or how I initially perceived it. And I'm not as constant and solid as I had been imagining or thinking or perceiving myself. So seeing, there's just the visual activity of seeing. There's the seeing with the mind, recognizing how the mind really does have an influence on what gets perceived. And then there's the seeing, maybe we could say seeing through, the insight, when we start to see the qualities of experiences, no longer lost in the content or just on the surface of what's happening, but to see the quality of it arising and passing away. So with that, I think I'll stop and open it up to see if there's some questions or comments. Okay.
What comes to mind to me is the eyewitness accounts of things are scientifically or empirically proven to be unreliable.
There you go. Thank you. That's right. That's right.
How would you deconstruct that?
Yeah. So we all have biases. That's kind of what I'm pointing to. Biases about what's important, what things mean, and how it relates to us. So it's impossible to see something actually perfectly clear because there's this, I'm using this word biases that we have. So it relates to it's actually not possible for a human brain to see something in the same way that a camera does. Even though we think that we are. And this is why we like to fight about what's actually there, because we're so convinced that what I saw is actually the truth. I don't know what you saw. You must have been somewhere else, but what I saw is the truth. Just not recognizing it's actually not possible to be completely like a camera. Thank you, Stan. Anybody else have a comment or a question?
I got another quick one.
Okay.
When we go into a museum, we see art, right? Maybe we browse through and we see art, and then something in us tells us, well, I want to go look at that piece of art. So I think when you're looking at something, maybe you're activating more things in your brain that you're connecting with, or you're interested to learn about or to look closer at. So I guess I think of seeing as just a quick overview,
Yeah.
and then looking is something that you're using to investigate something.
Yeah, I would say investigate. And I would say that art in particular, we could say that art has is a part of a language that, well, maybe I don't have to go that far, but to say there's a resonance. Some pieces like, oh, we can feel a little stirring in ourselves, and then we want to go look. So then we could just get curious, like, what are the types of things that I feel this stirring and want to go look? All right, is it the ugly things, or is it the confusing things? Is it the beautiful things, or I don't know, something like this. Thank you. So back there.
So would you say that when we're seeing or looking, the lesser filter we have, like the less filter that we have within us, in our perception would be, we see truer, we'd look truer?
Yeah, this word true, right? Let's see. So the less filter we have, yes, but I think it's not possible for humans to have zero filter. But I think the power here is recognizing what are our filters. What are we oriented toward? What biases do we have when we look at things? What catches our attention and looks at? Thank you.
Thank you. So I was reminded of Shakespeare and like Much Ado About Nothing, right? Where when you watch a play, you as the audience know you have information, right? Dramatic irony that the characters don't have, and you watch them unfold this drama that has to do with their perception, what they see, what they overhear, what they think they hear, and you're sort of caught in the story, and at the end you're like, well, boy, if they had only known this, right? They don't know the whole story, and that's why they're kind of stuck in this suffering, if we wanted to put it into that context. And sometimes it resolves well, like in Much Ado About Nothing. It's a comedy, and so at the end everything gets resolved and all the misunderstandings are solved, and there's one bad guy and he gets caught and whatever. And then sometimes Merchant of Venice, it ends up very poorly for a lot of people, and it's kind of the same, right? So, it can be dangerous, and sometimes it can be comedic, and we can learn from it. So anyway, that's what I was drawn to. I don't know if others thought about it like that. But
Yeah,
anyway.
yeah, thank you. Right, I mean, the human life is filled with this, right? There's even how many movies are like he said, she said kind of versions too, right? Or something like this. Yeah, yeah. Misunderstandings. But it can be, I was thinking about one thing about vision, which is also the same for hearing, is to notice the seeing to looking. Because that's like can be a way in which we can notice what are the things that we catch us. The same thing could be happening for hearing and listening, right? So, yeah, thank you. Anybody else have a comment? Thanks.
So a lot of interesting ideas here. In my experience, the dilemma has been, on one hand, being very, very aware of cognitive biases and filter of our perception, and leaning very heavily on that, at the cost of invalidating or perhaps challenging my own beliefs and perceptions. And so I wonder if you have thoughts on navigating that line between acknowledging the limitation of our views and biases and the way we filter and look for particular things on one hand, but on the other hand, not gaslighting ourselves. It's a tricky, something I've really struggled with.
So often let's see if I understand this, what you're pointing to here, is if we have this idea that, okay, I want to find out what's true and what's right, maybe I'll just use this word true, then we're like, okay, well, I know I have some cognitive biases, but then like what's true? But instead, if we hold things like, well, this is my current understanding, this is what makes sense to me, this is my hypothesis. So our views, if we just not hold them tightly, just like, this is what makes sense to me. Instead of insisting, okay, this is true, it's like, okay, this is what I think how it is. And then we're not lost always trying to find what's right. We're not, trying to find what's the most true, the least biased, because of course we don't want to be biased in a way that's harmful especially, but it's not possible for humans to see things completely true. Even though we want to think that we can, and we want to think that we are and those other people aren't. Is this helpful?
Yeah, I think so. I guess, so if none of the beliefs or views we have are necessarily true, at some point we have to act on beliefs or make
Yeah.
decisions based on our perceptions.
Yeah.
And either you act on a decision, or you act on a perception or belief that is, it could be wildly different, two options, and
But we do, but it's like, okay, well, this is my current understanding. This is what makes sense. Instead of saying this is true, saying
Yeah.
all the data I have supports this view. This is what, I'm going to make a decision based on this. We may never know whether it's actually
yeah.
true or
So I
not
guess
true.
maybe the question then is the value of questioning those beliefs. So if something feels and appears true or reliable, the value of really heavily questioning those beliefs and perceptions. On one hand, that can be very helpful in seeing more clearly. On the other hand, the danger can be, like I said, gaslighting
Or
yourself.
nihilism, right? It's like
Yeah.
nothingness.
Yeah. So denying a truth that may be very protective, for example.
I'm sorry, denying.
Denying a belief that may be very protective.
Oh. I think denying a belief that may be very protective.
Yeah, or aggressively challenging a very deeply held belief.
Oh, here we go. Are we talking about somebody else's beliefs or our own?
Our own, yeah.
I think our own, it's to question it, I think it's fantastic, actually.
Yeah.
Like, am I sure about this? Yeah, I think so. And then just recognize, when more data comes in, we may change our mind or something like this. I think there's real value in looking at our beliefs.
Interesting, yeah. Thank you.
You're welcome. You're welcome. Okay. So I wish you a wonderful rest of the evening, and that's at the right temperature. Thank you.